Every election season, people around the world hear the same words: freedom, representation, government by the people. Democracy is often described as one of humanity's greatest political achievements. A system where citizens choose their leaders and shape the future of their nations. But what if the story of democracy is not as simple as we have been told? What if the system we call democracy today looks very different from the one that was first created? Because the truth is, the early versions of democracy were far from perfect. In fact, when democracy first appeared thousands of years ago, most people were not allowed to participate at all. Women could not vote. Foreigners had no voice. And millions of people living under democratic governments had no political power whatsoever. So how did democracy truly begin? Who was it really created for? And how did it evolve into the political system used across much of the modern world? Today we explore the hidden history behind democracy, a story of power, struggle, revolution, and political change that shaped the world we live in today. Welcome to Untold Reality Daily, the channel where we explore the untold stories of history. From forgotten empires to untold political revolutions, we uncover the truths behind events that shaped our world. If you enjoy deep historical documentaries and stories that challenge what we think we know, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss our next story. Now let us begin. The world before democracy. Long before democracy existed, most societies were ruled by kings, emperors, and powerful elites. Authority flowed from the top down. A single ruler or a small group of nobles made decisions for entire populations. In many ancient civilizations, political power was believed to come from divine authority. Kings claimed they ruled by the will of the gods. Subjects were expected to obey without question. This system dominated much of the ancient world. Across regions such as ancient Egypt, powerful pharaohs controlled vast territories along the Nile River. In Mesopotamia, city-states were ruled by kings who enforced laws and commanded armies. In these societies, ordinary people had little influence over how their governments operated. Their role was to farm, work, pay taxes, and serve in wars when required. Political participation was not something most people even imagined. Power belonged to rulers, and rulers rarely shared it. Yet as societies grew larger and more complex, cracks slowly began appearing in these rigid systems. Trade expanded. Cities became more crowded. And new groups of citizens began demanding a voice in how their communities were governed. Among the places where these pressures became strongest was a group of small city-states located along the Mediterranean Sea. One of these cities would eventually become famous for introducing a radical idea. An idea that power should not belong only to kings, but to the people themselves. That city was Athens. And it was here that one of the most influential political experiments in human history would begin. The birth of democracy in ancient Athens. By the time the idea of democracy began to emerge, the city of Athens was already a powerful and influential city-state in the ancient Greek world. Athens was not ruled by a king at that time. Instead, political power was controlled by wealthy aristocrats. These elite families dominated government offices and made decisions that affected everyone in the city. For ordinary citizens, this created growing frustration. Farmers struggled with debt. Poor citizens often lost their land. Some even fell into forms of debt slavery. Many Athenians believed the political system favored the wealthy and ignored the struggles of the common people. Tension began building across the city. Social unrest increased. Some feared Athens could fall into chaos. It was during this period of instability that a series of political reforms began to reshape the city. One of the earliest reformers was Solon. Solon attempted to reduce inequality by canceling certain debts and freeing people who had fallen into debt slavery. He also reorganized the political system so that more citizens could participate in government. But even these reforms did not completely solve Athens' problems. Power struggles continued. Different factions competed for influence. Eventually, a leader named Cleisthenes introduced a set of changes that would permanently transform the political system of Athens. Cleisthenes reorganized the population into new political groups based on geography rather than family wealth. This weakened the influence of powerful aristocratic families. He also created a new system where citizens could gather in a public assembly to debate laws and vote on decisions. For the first time in history, large numbers of ordinary male citizens were allowed to participate directly in governing their city. This new system became known as democracy. The word itself came from two Greek terms, demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power. Together, the term meant rule by the people. But the reality of this early democracy was far more limited than many people imagine today. Women could not vote. Foreign residents had no political rights, and enslaved people made up a significant portion of the population, but were excluded entirely from political participation. In reality, only a small percentage of people living in Athens were considered citizens with political power. Even so, the Athenian experiment was revolutionary. For the first time, a society had attempted to build a government where citizens could directly participate in shaping laws and policies. It was an idea that would influence political thinkers for centuries. But democracy in Athens would not last forever, and the system would soon face challenges that revealed both its strengths and its weaknesses. The dark side of ancient democracy. Although Athens is often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, the reality of that early system was far more complicated. In theory, democracy meant rule by the people, but in practice, only a small portion of the population had the right to participate. To be considered a citizen in Athens, a person had to meet several strict conditions. They had to be male. They had to be born to Athenian parents. And they had to reach adulthood. This meant that the majority of people living in the city had no political voice at all. Women were excluded entirely from the political system. They could not vote. They could not speak in the public assembly. And they could not hold government office. Their roles were largely confined to family life and the household. Foreign residents, known as metics, also had no political rights. Even if they had lived in Athens for many years, paid taxes, or contributed to the economy, they were still excluded from participating in government. But perhaps the most striking contradiction of Athenian democracy involved slavery. A large number of enslaved people lived and worked in Athens. They built infrastructure, worked in homes, and supported the economy. Yet they had no freedom and no political representation. In fact, the labor of enslaved people helped make it possible for many Athenian citizens to spend time participating in politics. This created a paradox. A political system that celebrated freedom and participation for some people was built partly on the unfree labor of others. Even among citizens, democracy had its challenges. Public debates in the assembly could become heated and chaotic. Speakers competed to persuade large crowds. Some leaders used powerful speeches and emotional arguments to gain support. This sometimes allowed charismatic individuals to manipulate public opinion. Political rivals could also be removed through a process known as ostracism. Citizens could vote to exile someone they believed had become too powerful or dangerous to the state. While this system was intended to protect democracy, it could also be used as a political weapon. Despite its flaws, Athenian democracy introduced ideas that would influence political thought for centuries. Concepts such as civic participation, public debate, and voting began to spread beyond Athens. Philosophers began analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of democratic systems. Some praised democracy as a way to give citizens a voice. Others warned that rule by large crowds could sometimes lead to instability or poor decision-making. As centuries passed, new political systems would rise and fall across different civilizations. But the experiment that began in Athens had planted a powerful idea, an idea that the people themselves could play a role in governing their society. And that idea would eventually travel far beyond the ancient Greek world, the Roman Republic, and the evolution of democratic ideas. As the influence of Athens slowly faded, another powerful civilization began rising across the Mediterranean world. This new power was ancient Rome. Unlike Athens, Rome did not adopt a system of direct democracy. Instead, the Romans created a political structure that combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and popular representation. This system became known as the Roman Republic. Under the Roman Republic, citizens did not gather in one large assembly to make every decision directly. Instead, they elected representatives to govern on their behalf. This idea of representation would later become one of the most important foundations of modern democratic systems. At the center of Roman political life was a powerful governing body known as the Senate. The Senate was made up primarily of wealthy and influential families. These senators debated laws, controlled financial policies, and guided the direction of the state. Although ordinary Roman citizens had the right to vote in certain assemblies, the political influence of elite families remained very strong. Like the democracy of Athens, the Roman system was not truly equal. Political participation depended heavily on social status. Wealthy citizens had far more influence than the poor. Women had no political rights, and enslaved people made up a large portion of the population, but had no freedom or representation. Yet the Roman Republic still introduced important political ideas that would shape future governments. One of the most important concepts was the idea of checks and balances. Instead of concentrating power in a single ruler, Roman leaders divided authority among multiple officials. Two leaders known as consuls were elected each year. Each consul had the power to veto the actions of the other. This system was designed to prevent any one individual from becoming too powerful. Rome also developed a system of written laws that applied to citizens across the Republic. These laws were publicly displayed so that people could understand their rights and responsibilities. Over time, the Roman Republic expanded its territory across vast regions of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But as Rome grew larger and more powerful, its political system began to struggle under the weight of its own expansion. Political rivalries intensified. Military leaders gained enormous influence. And eventually the Republic collapsed. In its place, Rome would become an empire ruled by powerful emperors. Yet even after the fall of the Roman Republic, the political ideas it introduced would continue influencing thinkers for centuries. Concepts such as elected officials, representative government, and checks on political power would later become central to the democratic systems used in many countries today. But the story of democracy was far from finished. For many centuries after the fall of Rome, democratic ideas would fade from much of the world. kings and monarchs once again dominated political life, and the struggle for political representation would take many generations before it returned to the global stage. The long age of kings and the disappearance of democracy. After the fall of the Roman Republic, the political ideas that had once encouraged citizen participation began to fade across much of the world. In many regions, political power returned to the hands of monarchs. Kings, queens, and emperors ruled vast territories with little input from ordinary people. Across Europe, societies entered a long period, often described as the Age of Feudalism. Under this system, land was controlled by powerful nobles who pledged loyalty to a king. In return, the king granted them authority over large territories. Peasants and farmers worked the land and paid taxes to these local lords. For the majority of people, political participation remained almost non-existent. Governments were hierarchical. Authority flowed downward from monarchs to nobles and then to the population below. In many kingdoms, rulers claimed that their authority came directly from divine power. This belief became known as the divine right of kings. According to this idea, questioning a king's authority was not just rebellion. It was considered a challenge to divine order itself. For centuries, this belief helped monarchs maintain strong control over their territories. But as trade expanded and cities grew larger, new groups began gaining influence. Merchants, craftsmen, and scholars started questioning the concentration of power in the hands of kings and nobles. Economic growth created new social classes that wanted a greater voice in government. One of the first signs that royal power could be challenged appeared in England during the 1300s. In the year 1315, a powerful document known as the Magna Carta was signed. This agreement forced the English king to accept that his authority was not absolute. The Magna Carta established the principle that even the ruler must obey certain laws. Although it did not create democracy in the modern sense, it introduced an important idea. The idea that government power could be limited, and that the rights of individuals could be protected by law. Over time, this principle would become one of the foundations of modern democratic systems. But the path toward democracy was still long and uncertain. Centuries of political conflict, revolution, and reform would pass before democratic ideas once again began transforming governments across the world. The revolutions that revived democracy. For centuries after the fall of Rome, monarchs dominated political life across much of the world. Kings ruled nations, empires expanded, and ordinary people continued living under governments where they had little influence. But by the late 1700s, powerful new ideas began spreading across Europe and the Americas. Philosophers, writers, and political thinkers started questioning the authority of kings. They argued that government should exist to serve the people. Among the most influential thinkers of this period was John Locke. Locke believed that every person possessed natural rights. Rights to life, liberty, and property. According to his ideas, governments were created by the consent of the people. If a government failed to protect those rights, citizens had the right to replace it. These ideas would soon inspire some of the most important political revolutions in history. One of the first major revolutions influenced by these ideas occurred in the 13 colonies. In the late 1700s, tensions grew between the colonies and the British Crown. Colonists objected to heavy taxes and political decisions imposed by a government located thousands of miles away. Many colonists argued that they had no representation in the British Parliament. Their frustration eventually led to open rebellion against British rule. This conflict became known as the American Revolution. After years of conflict, the colonies declared independence and formed a new nation. This new country, the United States, created a constitution that established a system of representative democracy. Power would be divided between different branches of government, leaders would be chosen through elections, and citizens would play a role in shaping the nation's political direction. Soon after, another dramatic revolution erupted across the Atlantic Ocean. In France, social inequality and economic crisis pushed the country into turmoil during the late 1700s. The monarchy faced widespread criticism. Citizens demanded political reform and greater equality. The result was the French Revolution. During this revolution, the French monarchy was abolished, and new ideas about citizenship and political participation spread rapidly. The revolution introduced the concept that sovereignty belonged to the people rather than the king. Although the French Revolution went through periods of violence and instability, it permanently changed political thinking across Europe. These revolutions marked a turning point in the history of democracy. Ideas that had once existed only in ancient Athens were now being revived and adapted for modern nations. But the expansion of democracy was still incomplete. In many of these new democratic systems, voting rights were still limited. Women could not vote. Many working-class citizens had little political influence. And in several parts of the world, slavery still existed even within nations that claimed to value liberty. The struggle to expand democracy would continue for generations. The fight to expand democracy. Although revolutions in the 1700s revived the idea of democracy, the new political systems that emerged were still far from inclusive. In many countries, only a small group of people were allowed to vote. Voting rights were often limited to wealthy landowners. Poor citizens were excluded. Women were denied political participation entirely. And in several nations, systems of slavery continued to exist even as leaders spoke about freedom and representation. This contradiction forced societies to confront a difficult question. Could a nation truly call itself democratic if large portions of its population had no voice in government? Across the 1800s, movements began forming to challenge these limitations. One of the most powerful struggles centered around the abolition of slavery. In countries such as the United States, millions of enslaved people were still denied freedom and citizenship. Activists, writers, and political leaders began demanding the end of slavery and equal rights under the law. These debates eventually erupted into the American Civil War. The war reshaped the political landscape of the nation. After slavery was abolished, new constitutional amendments were introduced that expanded citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved men. Yet even with these legal changes, equality remained difficult to achieve. Many communities continued facing discrimination and barriers to political participation. At the same time, another powerful movement was gaining momentum. Women across Europe and North America began organizing campaigns for political rights. For generations, women had been excluded from elections, public office, and decision-making institutions. Activists, known as suffragists, demanded that women be granted the right to vote. These movements gained strength throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. After decades of protests, political organizing, and advocacy, many countries eventually granted women the right to vote. This achievement marked one of the most important expansions of democratic participation in modern history. But the struggle for democracy did not stop there. Across the 1900s, many regions around the world were still controlled by colonial empires. Millions of people lived under governments imposed by foreign powers. In Africa, Asia, and other regions, independence movements began challenging colonial rule. These movements demanded self-determination and political representation. As colonial empires collapsed during the mid-1900s, many newly independent nations began adopting democratic systems. The idea of democracy was spreading across the globe. But as democracy expanded, it also faced new challenges: political corruption, economic inequality, and debates about how democratic systems should function in an increasingly complex world. These challenges would shape the next stage in the evolution of democracy in the modern world. By the middle of the 1900s, democracy had spread farther than ever before in human history. Across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia and Africa, new governments were being formed with constitutions, elections, and systems designed to represent the will of the people. After the devastation of global conflicts such as Second World War, many nations began placing greater emphasis on human rights, political participation, and representative government. International organizations were created to promote cooperation and stability among nations. One of the most influential of these organizations was the United Nations. Many democratic governments began adopting principles that emphasized the protection of civil liberties, freedom of speech, and the right of citizens to participate in political decision-making. Elections became one of the central features of modern democracy. Citizens were given the opportunity to choose leaders, vote on policies, and influence national direction through the ballot. Over time, democratic systems developed different forms. Some countries adopted parliamentary systems where elected representatives choose national leaders. Others used presidential systems where citizens vote directly for a head of state. Despite these differences, the core idea remained the same. Political power should ultimately come from the people. Yet modern democracy has also faced new challenges. Economic inequality has raised questions about whether all citizens truly have equal political influence. Political polarization has intensified in several democratic societies, making compromise and cooperation more difficult. The rise of new technologies and social media has also changed the way information spreads and how citizens engage with political issues. In some cases, democratic institutions have struggled to adapt to these rapid changes. Around the world, debates continue about how democratic systems should evolve to meet the needs of modern societies. Supporters argue that democracy remains the best system for protecting freedom and encouraging citizen participation. Critics point to flaws such as corruption, inefficiency, and the influence of powerful interests in political decision-making. The story of democracy, it seems, is still unfolding. It is not a finished system, but rather an ongoing experiment shaped by the choices of each generation. The history of democracy is far more complex than the simple definition often taught in classrooms. From its early beginnings in Athens to the political revolutions of the 1700s and the global struggles for voting rights in the 1800s and 1900s, democracy has constantly evolved. It has expanded. It has faced challenges, and it continues to be debated even today. What began as a political experiment in a small Greek city has grown into one of the most influential systems of government in the modern world. But democracy has never been perfect. Its strength has always depended on the participation, vigilance, and responsibility of the people who live under it. If you found this documentary insightful, consider subscribing to Untold Reality Daily for more untold stories from history. And let us know in the comments what topic you would like us to explore next. Because sometimes the most important truths about our world are hidden in the stories of the past. Thank you for watching.